Sigmund Freud once wrote that the purpose of human life is the attainment of happiness, and that the pleasure principle, the drive to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, is the fundamental engine of human psychology. Viktor Frankl read these words carefully. He had studied under some of Freud's closest associates, had corresponded with the master himself as a young man, and owed an enormous debt to psychoanalysis. But he looked at the men and women in the concentration camps, and he looked at the patients in his clinic, and he reached a different conclusion. Human beings, he argued, are not primarily pleasure-seeking animals. They are meaning-seeking ones. And the difference is not merely semantic. It changes everything. The disagreement begins with the fundamental question of human motivation. Freud's model, refined over decades, held that the libido, broadly, the life drive, encompassing sexuality and the impulse toward pleasure, was the primary force behind human behavior. Psychological health was, in this framework, largely a matter of the successful navigation of biological drives, expressing them appropriately, sublimating them productively, and managing the inevitable conflicts between desire and social constraint. Neurosis arose when these drives were repressed or distorted. The path to health ran through insight into the unconscious forces that drove behavior. Frankl had enormous respect for this framework. He regarded Freud as a genuine giant, a man who had opened the interior life of the human being to systematic investigation for the first time. But he identified what he believed was a critical blind spot. Freud's model, he argued, reduced the human being to an organism, a sophisticated one, but an organism nonetheless, pushed and pulled by drives it did not choose and could not fully master. The specifically human dimension, the capacity for reflection, for choosing values, for committing to purposes that override biological imperatives, was, in Frankl's view, fundamentally absent from the Freudian picture. He had witnessed this absence proven wrong in the most extreme laboratory imaginable. In Auschwitz, human beings gave away their last piece of bread. They comforted the dying when they had barely strength to stand themselves. They maintained private rituals of dignity, washing their faces with melted snow, standing straight when they could have slumped, not because it increased their chances of survival but because it expressed something they would not surrender, their identity as persons, not animals. None of this was explicable by the pleasure principle. It was intelligible only as the expression of meaning, of something worth living and dying for that transcended biological self-interest. Frankl did not simply invert Freud. He did not claim that pleasure was unimportant or that the insights of psychoanalysis were worthless. He argued instead that pleasure was a consequence, not a goal, that happiness is a byproduct of meaningful engagement with the world, not a destination that can be approached directly. When the will to meaning is satisfied, pleasure follows naturally. When it is frustrated, no amount of deliberately pursued pleasure fills the gap. The person who eats, drinks, entertains, and stimulates themselves without pause, and still feels hollow, is not suffering from insufficient pleasure. They are suffering from insufficient meaning. This distinction has sharp clinical implications. The treatment model implied by Freud focuses on uncovering unconscious conflicts, resolving early developmental fixations, and liberating the energy trapped in repression. The treatment model implied by Frankl asks a different first question. Not what is wrong with you, but what are you living for? Not what drives you from below, but what calls you from ahead. Frankl called this orientation toward future meaning, toward a task, a person, or a value that pulls the person forward, the fundamental therapeutic lever. Modern neuroscience has, perhaps surprisingly, provided some evidence for Frankl's side of this argument. Research on the dopamine system has complicated the simple equation of dopamine with pleasure. Dopamine, it turns out, is primarily a seeking chemical. It is activated not by the receipt of reward but by the anticipation of it, and most powerfully by the pursuit of goals that the organism has chosen to value. In other words, the neurochemistry of motivation is oriented not toward pleasure received but toward meaning pursued. We are wired, at the deepest level of the nervous system, not to consume but to seek. The cultural consequences of privileging the Freudian model over the Franklian one are visible everywhere. A therapy culture focused primarily on the resolution of past conflicts can leave patients technically healthier but still purposeless, relieved of their neurosis but still without a compelling reason to get out of bed. A consumer economy built on the promise of pleasure reliably delivered, through products, entertainment, experiences, has produced, by almost every measure, an epidemic of meaninglessness. Freud explained a great deal about why we suffer. Frankl explained something Freud left out, what we are suffering for. And it is that second question that turns out to be the one that matters most. Frankl's debate with Freud ultimately invites a question each person can answer from their own experience. Are you most alive when you are feeling good, or when you are doing something that matters? Most people, if they reflect honestly, will identify peak experiences not with the receipt of pleasure but with the moment of full absorption in something genuinely important, the work that demanded everything, the person whose need called out the best in them, the cause that asked for more than comfort could provide. This is the empirical case for the meaning principle over the pleasure principle. It is available not only to those who have read Frankl but to anyone who has ever noticed that the most memorable days of their life were not the most comfortable ones. Frankl's life was the most extreme demonstration of this truth. The rest of us have only to look at our own. Subscribe to the Psychology of Viktor Frankl to explore more of his timeless ideas.